Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. That was incredibly interesting and inspiring. I was particularly interested in the example you started off talking about, the curb cut program, and the significance of advocating for something, and the way you use that as a metaphor for the fact that advocating for something that helps people who have a particular need can actually benefit the whole community. But it also seems to me that one of the key issues that is facing the philanthropy sector more generally, and also in Australia, is getting that balance between programs and advocacy. And you were talking about threading a needle and the fact that that can actually come with some risk of alienating people or creating, difficulties. I just was wondering if you'd had any sort of examples or instances where you found the advocacy challenging or present problems for you, or where you feel like you've made mistakes that maybe we could learn from in that space.
Thank you. It's a great question, and I'll start with a little bit of a story. I didn't talk about the fact that most of my career has actually been in local government, and so I have been the object of plenty of advocacy over the years. And one of the things that was different for me, actually, in coming into philanthropy is how nice people were to me. And it was actually a little unnerving, to tell you the truth. I mean, one of the things about local government is you never have to wonder how people are thinking about your work. But given the power dynamic in philanthropy, and then being the CEO of a philanthropic institution, I've been more handsome, my jokes are funnier, and just all that. And so I'm not the object of the same kind of advocacy. But what I will say is that, we rely quite frequently on partners in the public sector, mayors, council members, legislators, and there are times when the advocacy that we are supporting is being brought to their doorstep. And we are supporting the very organizations that are thorns in their side. And so one of the things that is very tricky in terms of the navigation of this work is balancing that. I have gotten phone calls from elected officials that have said, Fred, what the hell are you doing? Why are you supporting these groups that are agitating and coming at me in this way? And in some cases, we can't support this, but in some cases, these groups are actually putting out candidates to run against others. And that's not, we don't support that kind of work, but the same organizations that we're supporting on other issues are doing that kind of stuff. And so it creates points of contention often. I gave you an example also of the housing piece where it was successful. But we have also made substantial investments in policy initiatives that have failed. And so in that case, it's very important, I think, for us to be able to have frank conversations at the staff level and between the staff and our board of trustees before entering into these around what we think the likelihood of success looks like, how much we're willing to invest, what our advocacy actually looks like, because there's a continuum. We could provide a grant. We can provide a grant and also bring our voice. The size of the grant matters. What kind of visibility we have on the issue matters. And so we also have a discussion about not only kind of whether we're taking a position, but what our position is going to look like.
Is that example the one you're talking about where you actually got people to vote for a tax to support public housing?
Yeah.
Was there any backlash on that when you were trying to advocate?
Not on that one, because the housing issue in our community has reached a point where I don't care who you are, you either are in it or know somebody who is affected by it. And so it was one of those issues that was almost like motherhood and apple pie in terms of trying to address it. We are currently working on something that is much more controversial. It is a statewide adjustment to property tax in the state of California that would raise the property tax for corporations who have had a cap on their property tax for many, many years. And we have gotten blowback from the corporate community about that. By the way, it would result in $11 billion more per year going to public schools in California. And we've gotten blowback there. I've gotten actually a couple of letters from donors at the San Francisco Foundation who have expressed their displeasure with it, and we have had conversations about it. We also, this was before I got there, we were one of the first foundations to step up and take a very public position around marriage equality, and that was another issue where there was some blowback. So we are used to kind of stepping into the arena, but it is not always smooth sailing.
It seemed that you started your talk with quite a radical idea, which is that helping people who have particular needs or who are especially disadvantaged actually benefits everybody in the overall community. I think both in Australia and in America, there's a very strong idea around sort of meritocracy. I heard a fantastic series of programs on public radio in the US about poverty in America, and there was that great line which is, you never talk to a self-made man about luck. And this idea that really people who are suffering different forms of disadvantage, somehow it is the result of something that is, there's an element of blame or responsibility for that. Yeah. Is that an idea that you run into when you are trying to advocate these types of programs? And how do you navigate around that? Yeah.
And I didn't mention this, but, data is very important in this regard as well. And just an example I'll give you. So our North Star, the way I've described it, is around race, racial and economic inclusion and equity. And we very deliberately lead with race. We lead with race because there are instances where the lack of opportunity is associated with income or class. There are instances where it exists because of the intersection of income and class, but there are also instances where it's really just about race. And to give you an example, and this is a kind of a roundabout way to answer your question, we did a study around equity in the Bay Area. We looked at the changing demographics, we looked at economics, we looked at health, other social indicators. And one of the most striking things was that as people in our region increased their educational attainment, across the board there were increases in income that were associated with that. But at the same time, as all groups raised their level of educational attainment, the income gap got wider based on more educational attainment, to the point where in Bay Area, if you are Latino and have a bachelor's degree, you can expect to earn $8 less per hour than a white person with the same degree. That's a very powerful statement that I think flies in the face of this conversation about meritocracy. Because if the same people can have the same level of educational attainment and the same degree, basically, and have that wide a gap in terms of what they're able to earn, that can only be about race. And it also explains it's about race and disadvantage that's been baked in over generations. And so things like that are the things that we use to kind of argue back against the stuff around meritocracy. There are other instances as well where you just unpack the data and it's clear as day what's going on.
Fantastic. I'll just throw that open to the other panellists and then we'll go to the floor for questions. But Carmel, do you have any sort of thoughts on the way advocacy sits in the work that you do?
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot I could say. I've been kind of listening this morning, wondering where I start. Thanks, Fred, for... I think that in Melbourne particularly, we're in a really interesting space for someone who's worked on the edge of these issues around inequality, culture, religion that plays out in Australia, and that you've probably caught up, Fred. I don't know if you've been reading the papers. It's been a bit quiet this week, actually. But every week there's been something about our African youth gang problem that we have, which I know from my experience in the US, our African gang problem is not really an African gang problem in an American context. But there is a lot going on about a state and a country that had dealt with diversity really well and difference, and that this issue of inequality and the fact that there are groups of young people that I work with a lot who are experiencing extreme forms of inequality is not understood as that at all. And there has been a complete lack of leadership or any attempt to unpack what that means. So I found that notion really interesting too, that when we try and have this conversation with communities, because most of these issues play out in the outer suburbs, growth corridors of Melbourne, where a lot of new arrival communities are now living in large estates with no public transport, etc. And the concept that this is about inequality never gets mentioned, and when you do, they think that it's an issue that is actually of no relevance, that the issue is about groups of black young people engaging in crime. So somehow I think that this issue hasn't even been addressed here about what that difference looks like.
Catherine?
I think there's another angle that we've been working on, which is gender inequality, and we see it particularly with older women, to the extent that we first hosted a session with the Productivity Commission after they did some work on inequality, and then we commissioned some research to understand, the time of our lives, we called it, ? About older women, and also funded per capita and fitted for work for work in that space, and also Vincent Care, really, for the redevelopment of Osnum House is also to include older women. But when you actually look, pay is still, it hasn't improved. The difference between gender, the pay gap hasn't moved in 20 years or something. And if you look at the lives of women and how much unpaid work they do and lower paid and casual and not putting money into super and ending up with, I think is it 40% less than men? It's something extraordinarily hopeless. You really are, for a lot of people, for a lot of older women, you're one or two, unfortunate events away from really a dicey situation. So, it could be ill health or divorce or any number, unemployment, any number of things. We've seen so many case studies in this work that, it is a bigger question of inequality. It's not just the person's fault. It just could happen to anyone.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll throw it open to questions because we've only got a limited amount of time, and I'm sure lots of people have things they would like to ask. Do we have roving microphones? We've got somebody over here we'll start with. Yep.
Hi, my name is Sue Chan. I work for local government in Melbourne. And I was really inspired by your talk, Fred, and thinking about data and statistics and by what the LMCF does in Melbourne. So it's a sort of broad question, and maybe it's for all of us, but really for both of you, about the status of the world and the structural issues that prevent what I think equality should be for everyone. And that's about, the fact that 1% of the world own half of the wealth of the world. The equality that's structural about the pay gap between men and women, the professionalism between men and women and their capacity to be leaders. So I think that there's all these structural issues that we're facing, and yet, Australia, 25 years of economic growth, and this morning we all walk past people who are sleeping rough. Mm-hmm. And I know that the LMSCF and other organisations are doing great work to support the most needy, but what is the work that philanthropic organisations are doing to lead a structural change? Mm-hmm. What is that advocacy with the governments when governments are being eroded and attacked? And I guess it's a very, very broad problem that I see, and I'd be interested in knowing how peak organisations, powerful organisations like yourselves, are inspiring a structural change.
That's a huge one. And it reminds me of the fact that I've seen snippets of what you are talking about but I've only seen snippets because I've been so engrossed in everything that's been happening at home with the current administration. And the reason I bring that up is because I actually think that what we're dealing with politically in the United States is a symptom of exactly what you are talking about in terms of the pitting of groups against one another, in terms of the divisive rhetoric and politics that have emerged in our country. And I actually think that we in philanthropy have a responsibility to step into the gap here and provide some of the moral conscience and some of the glue for a different kind of conversation in our communities that leads to a different kind of discourse around the issues that we're trying to deal with and a different kind of structural analysis of why we're here. That doesn't mean that we have to get into partisanship and selecting one candidate or one party over another. But I often think when it comes to some of these issues, we are making issues partisan that shouldn't be. Civil discourse should not be a partisan issue. The ability of one's race or address or class to be a proxy for or a predictor of what their lot in life is going to be should not be a political or partisan issue. These are all things that I think are really important for us to, as people in philanthropy in the nonprofit sector, the civil society, so to speak, to be more visible around and speak up around. I think a lot of us shy away from it because of the reputational risk and controversy that's associated with it. But there comes a point when silence in it is enabling around this stuff, and I think it's really important.
Just on that, just a very technical question, but do you actually hire or work with lobbyists? Is your work directed specifically at lobbying people with political power? How much of it is sort of vocal public leadership, and how much of it is actually trying to influence specifically?
Yeah, so we actually don't hire lobbyists, but we have colleagues who do. And when we are working on a specific issue, we use our own voice. And the one thing I will say about this is that one of the things that we're learning in this kind of work is that it's very important for us to understand our role and place in relationship to our partners. Because one of the things that we don't want to do inadvertently is subvert or undermine the work that we're supporting with our partners by stepping into it and diminishing their power or displacing their power in their advocacy agenda as well. And so we also often find ourselves, before jumping into this stuff, having a lot of conversations with the folks on the ground who are our partners and asking them first whether our participation or advocacy is value added or whether it is a distraction. And so I think that's an important part too.
Catherine, you want to say?
Yeah, a couple of points, just following on from that. Just as examples, we don't hire lobbyists, but we do fund, say, the Council for Homeless Persons. We funded their conference, and we funded free registrations for people with the lived experience of homelessness so they could attend and be part of discussing affordable housing opportunities. And we do fund Transforming Housing Partnership at the University of Melbourne, who've done a lot of brilliant policy work, which has actually been now taken up, even the definition of affordable housing and some site selection criteria, particularly the definition, has been taken up in the Planning and Environment Act. So we try and give our partners the capability to do the work they need to do. That's not to say, though, I mean, philanthropy is able to take a longer term view, and we're not business and we're not government. So there has been a lot of discussion at the Philanthropy Australia conference about whether we should be more active in helping develop more of a vision for Australia, and this sort of idea of, is there time for economic reform where we now take into account social and environmental externalities, and that there's a lot of, particularly the private foundations are quite keen to fund some of that really innovative work on economics. So I think it's an interesting time for philanthropy. It was we all had a lot to ponder after the last 2 days.
Can I add one thing here? We have, and this is also in response to your question, we have recently started making the economic argument for equity. And the reason for that is one of the other things that came out of this study that we did around equity in our region is we actually looked at what the Bay Area economy would look like if we were to close that racial income gap that I just described. And the punchline is that it would result in $114 billion more circulating in the Bay Area economy. So we have started to talk about this as not just a moral and ethical imperative, but an economic imperative. That we can't really continue to afford as a region to leave so many people behind if we want to continue to be competitive as a region. And that the notion of this work being about different ways to split limited resource is the wrong way to think about it. And that really the benefit associated with this is that it's a growing of the pie rather than a different way to split the pie. And I think that that is a powerful argument. And increasingly, I find myself, because I believe it's a moral and ethical imperative, conflicted, but I've just come to the conclusion that if you've come to this conclusion because of the economic imperative, that's cool too. And that will create a different set of potential stakeholders in this work that has the potential to be even more powerful.
Fred, I was just wondering, one of the issues that we're dealing with here too that I would like your view on is this whole notion of trying to understand that there is groups who are facing inequality more, so these two people of colour. How do you take the community and the white community, so if you look at what's happened with Trump in the US, because I think philanthropy as an NGO is saying, I think they can play an important role in this whole advocacy piece around knowing that, yes, you could be white, you could be black, you could be brown, you could be male, female, old, that actually getting a job for everyone helps the community. But it's a very hard, we're finding here now, for the poor white person in outer suburban Melbourne whose son or daughter can't get a job to say, well, why should this Indigenous or black young person get a heads up? And having that conversation is difficult, and I think philanthropy's got a really important role in helping facilitate that. Have you, could you tell us about how you've struggled or what you've done?
Absolutely. So that is one of the primary reasons why our North Star is around racial and economic inclusion and equity, because there are aspects of this that are absolutely about income and not about race. And we've got to be able to respond to that as well. I'll give you an example. There's a big movement right now in our part of the region around bail reform. And I don't know if you all have the bail system here, but that's an economic oppression. You are in jail because you are poor. Not anything else. And white people are affected by that the same way that African American or Latino people are. And there are lots of instances where it's just about income, and it's really important to highlight those and work on those and achieve wins on those as well. I think it's really, really key. One thing I will say though, we are not focused at all on trying to win over the hearts and minds of the kinds of people in the United States who were rioting in Charlottesville, South Carolina, around taking down Confederate statues. We are not trying to change the minds of people who are convinced in an ideological kind of way that one community's gain has to be another community's setback. We're trying to win over folks who we think are winnable.
There's another question just down here at the front. Lady here.
Hi, I'm Louise from Australian Communities Foundation. I'm just interested in how you brought your donors along with you with your social justice agenda. Yeah. At Australian Communities Foundation, we've got a similar makeup to you in terms of donor-advised funds and then an endowed pot of money as well that has a really strong social justice agenda. And we're quite young. We've only been running that particular fund is quite young. It's only been around for the past 2 years. So we're starting on that journey of communication with our donors on social justice agenda and bringing them along in the process. So I'm just wondering about the types of activity, communications, all of those kinds of things that you used.
Great question. I'm glad you asked it. So just a little bit of background here. For the longest, we were 2 different organizations underneath the same roof when it came to the work that we were doing with the foundation's endowment programmatically and what we were doing with donors. We were running a theory, and this is a theory that a number of community foundations in the United States run with, that the way that you maintain your attractiveness to donors is by being as opaque as possible around what you believe in so that you don't offend anybody. And we've changed that. And our business model now is that we believe that if we are crisp and clear and visible around what we believe in, if we are demonstrating our belief by having impact on the work with our grant making and through our leadership, that if we can capture the attention of existing donors at the foundation around that body of work, that we will be effective and successful in attracting new donors to the foundation and donors who really want to be a part of that journey. And that if we lose people in that journey, that is okay because we will gain more than we will lose. So that's really what we're about. And I just want to tell you a few things that we do. One is when I described the planning that went into the establishment of that North Star, we had focus groups with donors. I had 3 different focus groups when we connected with probably around 50 donors at the foundation, asking them or telling them where we were headed and asking them for feedback. The most negative comment that I got was from a donor who said, you know, all this stuff that you're doing around advocacy and race and class is not something that I would support with my donor advised fund, but I could see why you've come to the conclusion that this is important, and I'm proud to be associated with an organization that's stepping out to take that risk. It's the most negative comment I got back then. The most negative comment that I got recently, I talked about this thing that we're doing, is tax on the business community. Got a very strong letter from a donor who took offense to what we were doing, both in terms of the content and the tone, which is fine. We don't expect everybody to agree with us, and we think the discourse is actually important. Where this donor crossed the line was that he used derogatory terms aimed towards Asians and African Americans in this correspondence. And we felt that crossed the line. And so we've actually decided that we want to terminate our relationship with that donor because they are not in alignment with what we're trying to achieve. We just can't be associated, if that's an organization that's trying to achieve racial equity, with folks who are using that kind of language and rhetoric, which again is the kind of language and rhetoric that has been unleashed by our political discourse right now. And so we are losing, in some cases, donors, but we think we're gaining more than we're losing. Just one other thing. We take donors on trips in the community. We encourage donors and create the forum for donors to have conversations with one another about their like interests. We bring experts around issues that we're working on to talk to donors, so we're doing all kinds of things.
Okay. Look, I'm sorry, we're going to have to actually wrap up there. We just ran out of time. It's a fascinating conversation. It's really, incredibly interesting, but we just have to stop right now. So thank you so much. I'm just going to hand back to Catherine. We just need to do a little quick thank you. But
yeah. Well, I'd just like to thank Misha, Carmel and Fred. It's been a really wonderful opportunity. The community foundations will be meeting with Fred for a bit longer this morning, so that's a great opportunity. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming.